All right, everybody, Evan here. This is part 2 of our Vue News application using the vue-cli and the News API, part of a larger project to really showcase how we can build a more dynamic project like this and capitalize on it in more meaningful ways going forward. So where we left off is we had our project functioning. We made a fetch request to the News API and we're successfully returning articles and using them to populate our HTML. So just to get us caught up, I've opened the application here in Sublime Text, which should be a text editor that you're familiar with. And once again, everything is white. Everything is white because Sublime doesn't know how to read a .vue file. So one more time, to fix that, you're going to click on plain text down here in the bottom and select HTML. And this is how we want to be able to read a .vue file. All right, so last time we got our project up and running so that we could preview it and see what we were working on using the terminal or git bash. Now, if you have already done the first video and taken a break, walked away, and are coming back to this now, you might be wondering what happened there. How do we get it up and running again? I know a lot of you are probably not terribly familiar with using these kind of workflows or getting a project up and running using the terminal. And as you might have guessed, if you find the index.html file in our actual Vue News app project folder and try and open that, well, we don't see anything. There's nothing here. And that's because our application is not rendering. This is not how we get it up and running. This is not how we cause it to render. So what we want to do instead is open up a terminal window or a git bash window to our project folder. And once again, you can use the snazzy little git bash here shortcut to open up a git bash window that takes you directly to the project folder you're trying to access. And once I'm here, everything has already been set up. We did it all in that first video. So to get this up and running, all I need to do is execute the following command: npm run serve. And it'll take a couple of seconds, but assuming there are no errors in, oh, look at that, I have errors. I will come back to that. These are errors, but they're not stopping it from actually hosting that development server. So we now have the project running again at localhost 8080, which we can see right here. So I can just type that into my browser and we have our application back up. And as you can see, we're pulling in dynamic news data. Let me just do this. Okay, so far so good. We've got everything back up. If I want to address these errors, so this run serve command doesn't like console logs. That's not a big deal. It doesn't bother me. And then it's getting a little finicky about my v-for loop because v-for loops should actually have a dynamic key generated for each item that they're rendering. I'm not going to worry about that now because it's not a showstopper. It's not hurting anything right now, but it is giving me a warning. That would be something to come back and revisit, come deployment time. So, so far so good. We just have the one app.vue file, the one app component, and I said that the next step that we wanted to do here was to carve up this application into components, take advantage of Vue's component architecture. So what that means is I want each of the articles that we see here, the image, title, author, source, and description, all of this content to be one individual and independent article component. Okay, kind of like how you might separate it as a bootstrap card or something. Now they're already separated each of these is its own div, and that's fine. But if I were to make sure that each one of these divs is rendered in its own independent component, it's going to make the architecture of my app a whole lot cleaner and a whole lot more organized, especially once we incorporate a search bar or filtering functions or the ability to select different sources, things like that. Once we incorporate more logic and more features into this application, if we kept everything in app.vue, it would get very complex and very messy very fast. So we can take advantage of components. And to do that, we're going to create a new component. Remember, we deleted the hello world component, which the app started with in the previous video, but now we're going to create a new one. And to do that, in my components folder, which currently is empty, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to save it as article with a capital A, article.vue. Now, if you were part of my program, I always told you never to start your file names with a capital letter. But component frameworks like React and Vue, in using those frameworks, this is actually the best practice. This is how things are done. Okay, capital A, article.vue. I'm going to save, and it's currently empty. So once again, the three things that go into a .vue file are a template element, a script element, and a style element. And as you can see, one more time, Sublime does not know how to read a .vue file. If that annoys you a lot and you're wondering why I'm even bothering to use a text editor like Sublime for .vue files, normally I wouldn't. Normally I would use something like Visual Studio Code, which can be set up to very easily read .vue files the way that we need. But I know you guys are familiar with Sublime. Sublime is a very minimalist text editor. I don't want to add complexity here. Okay, so this keeps everything nice and simple. It gets rid of all the colored bubbles and bells and whistles. Okay, so template for HTML, script for JavaScript, style for CSS. Now we want one article component for every article of news. And we need to be able to access this article component from our app.vue file. So in the same way we imported hello world, or in the same way that it was automatically imported in the beginning, I'm going to import articles. So inside the script section of my app.vue file, I write import, and then I choose how I'm going to refer to the articles component here in app.vue. And I'm just going to refer to it as article. Okay, so import article from, and then in quotes, we use the relative file path, which leads to article.vue. Now, in truth, you can actually leave off the .vue extension and it will still find the file accurately, which is kind of cool, but I'm going to leave it there so as not to confuse anybody. Okay, no errors, so far so good. Now we have access to article, which is effectively everything inside this this file, or everything that we choose to export inside the script tag in this file. In app.vue, we have access to article inside app.vue, and we want to declare article as a component that app.vue is going to use. So here under data, or we could do it under mounted, but somewhere inside the Vue instance that is contained inside this file, I want to add, let me turn that down. I want to add a components object, and in this object I'm going to declare what components this app.vue file should have access to. And there's only one, article. Okay. Now I'm not going to leave it as article. I actually want to be able to refer to this in my HTML as app article. Okay, or I could do it this way. Both of those will have the same, will read the same way once everything is rendered. Okay, so this means that in order to create an article component as a custom HTML element, I would need to use the app article tag. That's the decision that I have made here. Okay, so before I make any app article tags, let's make sure that there's some real content inside the article component. Okay, first of all, I'll set up this export object, although I don't know that we're going to need to have any data in here at the start. And what do we want inside the HTML? What do we want the markup for this component to be? We effectively want it to be whatever this is, this div. So for right now, I'm going to copy all of this over here. Now, a reminder about these templates: they can only contain one root element. There can only be one div in here. Okay. So a v-for loop on that root element, that div that it contains, is definitely not going to work. So I'm going to get rid of this entirely. But we still want all of this dynamic data. So I'm going to keep that for now. This article.url2image and article.description, article.source.name, etc. I'm going to keep all of that, and we're going to come back and talk about how to access this article data from the parent component, the app component. Okay, so with this moved over here, I'm going to delete this, and inside this div with the class of row, I'm going to create an app article element. And on this app article element, on this component, this custom component, this is where I want to execute my v-for loop. And it's going to look exactly the same. Article in articles. Okay, so for every article, for every item inside the articles array in our view instances data object, it will render an article component. And now the only thing that we need, because if I save like this, we don't see anything. We don't see anything. The only thing that we need is to actually communicate the data from this article, the item in the array that's being fetched from the API. We need to communicate that through from this parent app.view file into the article.view component. So first, to make sure this is working, I'm just going to put some dummy text inside, not in here. I'll put it inside the article component. And nothing is rendering because we're hitting a lot of errors now, I would expect. Yeah, that's a lot. Okay, so it has no idea what all of these data points are. So I'm going to comment all of it out until we have it set up correctly. Now, without those errors, we can see that lorem ipsum inside the article component is being rendered a bunch of times. Each one of these represents an individual article component being rendered. So the v-for loop is working. v-for loop is working. It's effectively parsing this app article markup into whatever we have in here. To make it more meaningful, we need to make this work. And the reason why it isn't working is because it has no idea inside article.view what the article object is. We need to pass this article into the app article component as what's called a prop. Okay? So the article in the article component is currently called article here, but I'm going to change it to data just because there's a lot of articles flying around and I don't want to make this any more confusing than it needs to be. Everything else will stay the same. Instead of article.title, it's data.title. Article.author has become data.author. Everything else is the same. Okay? But it still doesn't know what the data object is. It doesn't have access to it. So let's give it access to that. In order to do that, in the component, when it is being rendered, we can use the vbind directive to communicate that data should be article. Okay? Articles in the v-for loop, once again, is this array which is populated by our fetch request to the API. Article here, I'll change it to news article. News article here is a single individual news article, single individual object inside the articles array. And we're now telling this component that the data attribute is that news article. Okay, and this data attribute is passed into the child component as a prop called data. Remember before we had the MSG attribute in Hello World, the message attribute. That was actually a prop, a piece of data being passed between components, between the parent app component and the child Hello World component. Now we're passing a data prop. We're giving it a value and passing it from the parent app component to the child article component. And the last step here, because it still won't work, but we're closer, is we need to tell the article component to expect this prop. And that's actually quite easy. Inside this export default object, this view instance object, where all of our view logic is going to be kept, we're simply going to declare it with a props array containing data as a string. All this does is tell this component to expect some package of data called data. I'm going to save, and we have an error. Reload and get a fresh console. So what am I looking at? Invalid string length. Nope. Oh, it's that dash. Can't have that dash in there. There we go. All right, so now we're back up and running again. We are working again. We have all the same news articles, once again populating our app, but now it's entirely component-based. Each of these articles lives in their own little environment with their own logic, with their own special business logic. So if we wanted to add functionality to these, we can now take care of that here inside the article.view component, rather than cluttering up the parent component even more. Okay, I hope that was at least a little clear from a top-down perspective. So we've broken all of our articles into individual components. What's next? Well, let's start creating a component to sit here up at the top that will allow a user to somehow customize the query, to allow a user to customize the news that will come back to them. Like right now, we're always receiving the top headlines from, well, right now it's Canada. I'll set it back to the US, once again to demonstrate how that changes the content. And if I change top headlines to everything, So we cannot combine everything and a country parameter. Let me pull up the documentation one more time. So everything, it looks like, requires some kind of search query. So we need a query. What is this going to be about? What do we want to search for? So whereas top headlines could be paired with the country query here, everything actually requires a search query like this. So I'm just going to throw this in here. We'll leave it at Bitcoin for now. And here we go. We now have a selection of articles all about Bitcoin. If I changed Bitcoin to Democratic Party, then we now have an awful lot of articles related to the Democratic Party. So this is where we could allow a user the opportunity to search for news that they want to see, news about something that they're particularly interested in. So for now, I'm going to leave it on everything, and I'm going to leave this search query string in here so that we can utilize that for a brand new component that is focused on allowing users to search for things. Okay, we know that the value that needs to change is just this here. So inside the app div, I'm going to create another div with a class of row since we're using Bootstrap. And inside here, I'm going to create an input. And a button. Okay, and we want a user to be able to type something in this search bar, click the button, and for the articles that are visible on the site to then change to reflect whatever search query a user typed in. Hopefully that makes sense. So how do we do that? Well, first we're going to need some kind of view data point that represents what a user wants to search for. Okay, search query. And I'm going to give this a default of, let's just have it be politics. Let's see what happens if I type politics in here. All right, fine. So we have a default search query of politics, which means this will automatically be what is fetched when our page loads. But we want a user to be able to change this. We want a user to be able to change this. So to tie these two together, this search query, and the value of the input, we're going to use a view directive called vModel. Okay, and just to demonstrate this, I'm going to print out the value of search queue right next to it to confirm exactly what you're going to see. So now we have politics automatically inside our input and politics right next to it. And as I change the content of the input, it also changes the value of search queue, that data point. Okay, so now these two, the input and search queue, are tied together, and I'm going to want to sub in the value of this search queue data point for this string in our query string. Okay, so what happens if I just delete politics and plug in this dot search queue? Still works. Okay, But now if I change this somehow and click my submit button, nothing happens. And that's because nothing is running when we click on this button. Okay, so let's create a method here in our Vue instance called call it change news. Okay, and we want change news to somehow update all of the articles on this page. And how do we do that? We do that basically by running the fetch request again with a brand new URL, probably with the new value of whatever this is. So let's make things a little bit easy on ourselves and start by creating a method called getNews. Let's stick with ES5. Okay, and what getNews is going to do is all of this. Okay, our API call is now executed by getNews. And in mounted, that lifecycle hook, which contains a function that will run when this app component is mounted, when it renders on the page, we're just going to want to call getNews. Oh, sorry. From our mounted function, it's not getNews, it's this.getNews. Once again, we're always going to be referring to the data, the Vue instance, and the data contained therein with the this variable inside a lifecycle hook, inside a method here. Anywhere like that, this is always going to refer to the data or methods made available to our Vue instance. So I want to access the method called getNews. I need to access it from here with this.getNews. I'm going to save. Oops, methods, not method. There we go. It's always the little typos that will get you, but we now have our news back up. If I clear my console, reload the page, no errors, everything is good. Okay, so getNews, this.getNews is running as soon as our page loads. And I'm going to get rid of this paragraph there. Okay. So now what do we really want to happen? We want, when you click on this button, we want getNews to run again with whatever the new value of search queue is. So honestly, we don't even need change news. We can run the exact same function, this.getNews, when this button is clicked. So to do that, we're going to use the vue directive, click equals getNews. From the markup up here, we don't need the this. Hopefully you've noticed that or remember that from our previous time with Vue. We don't need this.news article. We don't need this.articles, not in the markup. When inside a Vue directive like this, we do not need to tell it to refer to the data and methods contained in the Vue instance. It will already know. So v-on-click equals getNews is going to tell this application to run the getNews function when this page loads. I'm sorry, when you click on this button. So I'm going to save. So far, so good. And let's change the text here. Click submit. And we have all new websites. Click again. Click again. And every time we change the value of search query, click the button, and and our page updates. All of the news updates. So far so good. We've added some new functionality. We've made it work. One way I'd like to take this further is I want that search query to disappear after I've already updated all of the articles. So how do we do that? inside get news, after we run our query, after all is said and done, I am going to reset the value of search q, which the input is modeled to an empty string. Okay, so now look, we loaded the page, we fetched all the news articles, and our search input bar is now empty, which is how I want. I don't want it to start with something already in there. That doesn't make sense. Okay, so now let's put this search bar and button in its own component. Let's put these guys in its own component. Just the input and the button. So I'm going to cut them for now. Let's plan this out. Let's create a component called app search. Okay, and in order to use a component called app search like this, I'm working backwards deliberately this time to give you another perspective on this process of component creation. In order to be able to use a component called app search, I need a component called app search declared in my Vue instances components section. So app search. And what component file is app search going to be served from? What is it going to load? What's going to render the component? Let's create a file called search.vue. And in order to recognize a file called search.vue here in my component registration, we need to import something called search from a file that's probably going to be called search.vue. And in order for this to work, we need to actually have a file called search.vue in the components folder. So let's create a new file, save it as search.vue, make sure it's reading in HTML, and I'm going to copy everything over from article and just clear out this stuff. And clear out the props. Okay, so we now have a base empty element called search.vue. I'm going to paste, oops, yeah, I did that. And I'm going to paste let me get this set up one more time. And I'm going to paste our input and button inside the search component. So I know it feels like a lot of moving parts, but honestly, the repetition's pretty good. If you're not sure how this, component creation really works, the best way to practice is really to create multiple components over and over again for yourself. Make components for everything. So we now have an app search component, but we need to hook up the functionality because it's no longer going to work. Okay, so if we're connecting the value of this input to a data point called search query, search queue, then we're going to need to remember to actually include it in the Vue instance. Let's make sure it's working. Okay, good. It's working because we now see the value of that data point inside the input. We're not done. We still have quite a few issues, not the least of which is we have a button that is trying to access a get news method which exists on the parent That's not going to work at all. So instead, we're going to create a custom method here inside the child component. And we're going to call this method change news. Change news. And that's the method that we're going to call when this button is clicked. And what change news is going to do, and this is going to look really strange, but bear with me here. It's going to access the view instance, and it's going to emit an event. And this event is going to be called news changed. And it's going to emit a package of data with this event. And that package of data is going to be the value of search query. Now, how do we make this make sense? Well, we need to listen for news changed in the parent component. And we're going to do this here. Be on news changed. What we're going to do is a couple different ways we can do this. And before I finish that thought, let's retool get news for a moment. I'm going to give it an argument called, a parameter called query. And this query is what we're going to fit right in here. Okay, and I'll leave that alone for now. And we're going to execute this .getNews with this .searchQ when the page loads as an argument. And that's still working. So far, so good. So then what we're going to do here is we're going to execute getNews with data. Data here represents the data package that is passed through when this event, this custom event, is emitted. I'm going to save here, reload. Now we're no longer getting any errors. So with design in here, let me hit submit, and it changes all of the news. You still have an issue. What's this? Data is not found in the instance of reference during render. What happens if I just get rid of this? Looks like it will still work. Yeah, here we go. So I didn't even need to remind it of the argument here. I simply called getNews, and because we're emitting a data package with this custom event, it automatically gets fed in as the argument here, query, which gets subbed into this query string, which updates our API call and grabs a whole host of new articles about whatever we're talking about here. Last thing, inside the search query, let's make sure that the input empties out after it's been executed. So I'm going to start with an empty search query. And we're just going to make sure that this .searchQ resets after our change news function executes. Reload one more time. We have an empty input. Updates the news, empties the input, fetches a whole new set of content. All right, so far so good. We've made two different components for serving two very different functions, and both of them are communicating with the parent application component in two very different ways. In the case of the article component, app is passing data down into the child component, which is then parsing that data and using it to populate all of this markup. In the case of the app search component, app search gives a user an opportunity to insert some dynamic data, and when they click a button, that dynamic data is passed upwards from this child component to this app parent component. And that then triggers a brand new API call, which completely updates the content of the site. All right, so I hope that was at least a little bit clear. It's definitely an introduction to component architecture, probably a touch more complicated than is necessary, but it's definitely good practice. And this is a good stopping point to hit the reset button, to jump back to the beginning of this video, watch through it again, code along with it again, or even jump back to the first video and code through both of them in one long gauntlet run and see how it's helping your understanding of what's going on now that you've done this for 2 or 3 times already. I'm not taking the time to dive into every single detail here, but you now have enough of a reference point to dig deeper into von if you need to dig deeper into vbind. You now have seen a custom event being emitted from a child component to a parent component, and that gives you all of the vocabulary that you would need to explore this further on your own. I would suggest try and emitting some of your own custom events. Maybe make additional buttons, and when you click on them, they emit a custom event that maybe changes the content of some H1 sitting in the parent application. Maybe it starts out as hello world right here, but when you click a button inside a child component, it changes to something different. See if you can manage that. Use what you've seen here and practice it, and then practice changing it and not completely breaking the application. So for the next step here, I'm actually going to switch from Sublime Text to Visual Studio Code. I think it's going to be good for all of you to see these .vue files the way they're meant to be seen. Not that Sublime isn't fantastic, and I do love it, but this is driving me crazy here. So for the next video, we're going to migrate all of this to Visual Studio Code, which takes no time at all. We're going to add additional functionality. In addition to the search query here, we're going to add some filters. We're going to add the opportunity for users to select news sources. We're going to add the opportunity for users to select countries of origin for the news. And that's going to be a little bit tricky because as we've seen, the everything news endpoint parameter in the API call does not pair with a country selection, and a search query does not pair with the top headlines parameter, which does pair with the country parameter. So a couple of complexities to navigate there, but we will work through it. We'll figure it out. All right, so once again, I hope this was helpful. Stick around, and we're going to add additional components, additional organization. We're going to make this look nicer. And then once all is said and done, we are going to talk about where to go from there, how to really stretch this project out and capitalize on it in all of the ways that I promised at the very beginning of this series. All right, thanks for watching.